This is Gemara Zevachim, Daf Kof, and we're holding on to the Testament Bays. We got about 10 lines to the bottom, but at the end, we sort of were running as we were just bringing all the different karbanos. So we're going to circle back up about 20 lines to the bottom. The first one on line is Bepesach, Loi Levar Mi Pesach, Viha Tanya. Once again, as we take leave of Chanukah, we'd like all the learning to continue being an incredible Schos Aliyas Neshama for Aryeh ben Ya'akov, sponsored by his family. The incredible Koyach HaTorah should continuously elevate the Neshama of Aryeh ben Ya'akov and ultimately be able to Yayishar on the entire Mishpacha B'siyata Dishmaya. Says the Gemara of Atanya Rabbi Shimon Omer. We just finished saying that Rav Shimon says that an oinen brings the karban pesach. Frak the Gemara, we have a brisa which is clear that an oinen does not bring the karban pesach. Again, the first one in line is be pesach ve'otanya. Frak the Gemara, Rabbi Shimon Omer. Shlamim, says the Torah. Kihu shalem mevi. When he's whole, he brings ve'inai mevi. Which right there is the kasha, because the Brisa says explicitly that you don't bring the shlamim when one is an einin. Minayin the rabbis as a taida. How do we know to include the taida into this rule that not only a shlamim is not brought when he's an einin, but even a taida? Marbini says it's in a similar vein. It's in kisimcha. It's in a matziv of simcha. The karban taida is brought by the oila regalim. Shalosh regalim and their oila regel. Continues the Gemara, and the Rabbi says oila. How do you know the oila is the same rule? Again, the same rule that you only bring it when you're shalim, not when you're an oinin. Marbani has oila shkein ba b'neder u'b'nedava. It's brought as an eder of Kishamim. Next, Menayim the Rabbi is Bechar, Meiser, Pesach. And this is the Kasha, because for Amar Pesach like the Shlamim, that means that the Pesach is only brought Kihu Shalem, and not when you are an Oinain. And the previous Brisa of Shimon said that an Oinain does not bring the karban pesach, and that an oinen, the previous brisa of Shimon says the oinen does yes bring, and from here we're learning that oinen does not bring. Marbani bachar meiser bashkein einon bain ala chait. That what they are not brought for a chait. Menayin the rabba, and therefore they have similarities to the shlamim. Menayin the rabba is chatas v'asham. How do you know chatas and asham is in the same vein? Tam lemer zevach. That again, they're all within the same rule. That they're not brought when the person is not shalim. They're not brought when he's an oinin. Tamalayimar, says the Torah, shlamim karbanai. And for those words we learn now called karbanai shu mevi kishahu shalim mevi ve'inai mevi kishahu oinin. So at the end of the long and lengthy brisa, the Gemara articulates what we just said a moment ago. Katani Mia, what do we see, Pesach? We see that the karban Pesach is included, that it's not brought when one is an oinain. So frak the Gemara, the Zelig Rav Shimon that says that an oinain, yes, brings the karban Pesach. Explains the Gemara, we're going to have multiple answers to the kasha that we just brought, the Sira and Rav Shimon. We're going to have an answer from Rav Chisda. We're going to have an answer from Rav Sheishes. We're then going to have multiple answers from Rav Mari at the end of the Amud and two more on the next Amud. So let's go. Says the Gemara, let's start with Rav Chisda. Amar Rav Chisda Pesach Kedei Nazba. The Bryce just listed Pesach, but it's not true. You, yes, would bring the karban even when you're an Einin. Rav Sheishes Amar Secretary, it's my Pesach. What does it mean by Pesach? It means Shalmei Pesach. Doesn't actually mean the karban Pesach. It means the shlamim that you bring. Iachi frakti Gemara Hainu shlamim. Tani shlam abba machmas Pesach. Tani shlam abba machmas atzon. Diloi tani shlam abba machmas Pesach. You would think that since it comes from the Pesach, it's like the Pesach itself. Not. Teretz number 3. Teretz number 4 and answering this stira is Rav Mari. Rav Mari Amar, as we turn over to Daf Kov, Loi Kasha, Kan, Shemeis Lameis, Biyadalid. There's a chiluk in cases, says Rav Mari. We have a stira, does an Einin bring the carbon Pesach or not, says Rav Mari. It depends. If it was Meis Lameis on the 14th, V'kivra Biyadalid, and the Kvura happened on Yudalid, that's where the Einin does not bring the carbon Pesach. But then he does, yes, bring the carbon Pesach according to Rav Shimon, even though he was in Einin on the beginning of the 14th. And the Gemara explains, Meis Loimas B'Yudalid V'kivra B'Yudalid Yoim Misa Toifes Leiloi Midaraisa. The Yoima Misa Midaraisa is that which creates the Aninos, and therefore that grabs hold of the nighttime Midaraisa. Meisla Meis Yud Gimel V'Kivra B'Yudalid Yom Kivura is only Midarabanan, meaning the Etzem Aninos was the day before on Yud Gimel. Now that we're having Yud Dalid says the Gemara is only going to be the Yom HaKvura, and that's only going to be a din dirabanan aninos, and therefore Einoi Taifes Leilai will not extend to the nighttime. Ella only midirabanan. Frekti Gemara on this teretz of Rav Mari, Amli Rav Ashi Rav Mari, Belahadi Gedani Amli Rav Shimon. That which we learned, they said to Rav Shimon said to Rav Yehuda, Teda, you should know, She'amru Einin Tvol Toiva V'Eichel Es Peschai, Avoloi Kachim, Nema Le Kamino Nema Le. Rav Yehuda should have responded, Kamino Chana Yamisa Daraisa Va'amre Li Yam Kfura Dirabanan. Meaning, if the chilik that Rav Mari just said is true, that there's two levels of aninos. There's a Yudalit to Yudalit, a real Spitz Aninos will call it, and therefore you can't have the government Pesach like the Braisa. And the Yudalit to Yud Gimel to Yudalit, which is only Aninos Derabanan. And that's where Rav Shimon says there's yes Aninos. Yes, Karban Pesach, excuse me. So why didn't Rav Yehuda just respond that simple detail that this is not full Aninos? It's only Aninos. Yom Kvura Derabanan. Says the Gemara that is indeed Shver. Kasha, and the Gemara leaves off with this being a question. And next Tara, a fourth Tara to answer up of Stira, is Abaye. Comes along Abaye, says Abaye, and then we're going to have one final Tara when we turn over the Amid Amir Hashem. But comes along Abaye, and Abaye says, 10 lines down, the first one line is Kasha. Says Abaye loy Kasha. Kan Shemeis Koidim Chatzos. Kan Shemeis Lacher Chatzos. The difference is, where did the Misa happen? When did Rav Shimon say you do not bring the Karban Pesach? Is if the Meis was before Chatzos on day 14. When do you yes? When the Meis was after Chatzos. And the Gemara explains, Koidim Chatzos Tlachsi LePesach. The Einin was not yet fit to bring the Karban Pesach. Chayli Anino, so nothing he could do. But Achar Chatzos, if in the morning he was not an Einin, Te'echsi LePesach, he grabbed all the obligation of the Karban Pesach. Lo Chayli Ale Aninos, so Aninos will not be Chal, and therefore will be able to bring the Karban Pesach. Says the Gemara. Umina Taimra, says Abaye, how do I know the Shanli ben Kodim Chatzos ben Achar Chatzos? Titania, we learned in our Braisa, Allah Yitama. Says in the pasuk, when the relative dies, he will contaminate himself or her. Mitzvah. What do we learn out from here? It is a mitzvah and not just a rishos. Loi ratza. Therefore, if he doesn't want to become tamei, mitami naisal karcha, we force him to. Umaisa b'yosef hakayin. Now what happened? Shemeisa ishtai berev pesach. And v'loi ratzi letama. He wanted to bring the carbon vessel. They forced him to do it. But this is schwer. Says the Gemara, says the pasuk for his sister. What do we learn out from there? No, we learn if someone is on the way, someone is going to shechtas karban pesach, or someone is going to give his son a bris milah, and v'shama Hashem meis. I would think maybe you become tummy. Amri lo yitama. And weiter, I would think Hashem shlo yitama la'achaysekach ein mitama la'meis mitzvah. Says the Gemara, nay, for the shiva krivim, for a relative, lo yitama. However, for a meis mitzvah, tama leimer la'achaysayu udeina mitama only dafka by his sister, aval mitama lemeis mitzvah. Yes, we come to meis mitzvah. So what do we see? We see that an einin does, yes, bring the carbon pesach, which is a stira, which seems to say the einin is not chayiv. Says the Gemara, la shema mina. So what's the chilik? Says Abaye. I'll tell you the chilik. Pasha, like I just said. Kan koidim chatzois, kan lachar chatzois. Says the Gemara, mimai. Not necessarily, Abaye, are you correct? Because I have another way of learning up the Braisa. Dilma, perhaps, I'll tell you, I divide Yachar Chatzois, or Vishmael, V'ha Rabbi Akiva. And there's two different shitas going on over here. The two Braisais, the first is Rabbi Akiva, the second is Rabbi Yishmael. Titanya, we learned in a Braisa 4 lines on the white lines, Lo Yitam Harishos, Div Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva, Imer, Chayva. Says the Gemara, no, Lo Sagodaitach. The Reish that here, Rabbi Akiva, Ketani, don't tell me that the first part of the Braisa is Rabbi Akiva. They tell me into the Braisa. Rabbi Akiva, Imer Nefesh Elu HaKrayvim. That when the pasuk says Nefesh, he refers to the Krayvim, Mace, Elu Harachaykim, those who are not related in the first wide line. La'aviv, to the father, Einai Mitama, Avo Mitameo, Lemeis Mitzvah. He's yes Tamei. Lemeis Mitzvah. Le'imai, says the pasuk, Hayakayin v'hu nazir. If he's a kayin and a nazir, le'ima hu deina mitame. To the mother, he's not mitame. Avam mitame oh lemeis mitzvah. But yes, mitame to the meis mitzvah. La'achiv. What do we learn out from there? Shem hayakayin gadol v'hu nazir. If he's a kayin gadol and a nazir, le'echav hu deina mitame. Only for the brother, he does not become tame. Avam mitame oh lemeis mitzvah. Uleachayse continues the Braisa matam Elohim Arishal v'shchas pischay ve'elo molas b'noi v'sham shameis meis. Our case, Yachal, I would think 2 lines at the bottom Yitame Amre lo Yitamo Yachal shivim mitam lachayse kacham mitam lemeis mitzvah tam leimer lachayse lachayse litam mitam oh lemeis mitzvah. You're yes mitame to a meis mitzvah. So what do we see? We see as Braisa is clear like Rabbi Akiva. And therefore, we're able to spalt and split and say one Braisa is Rabbi Yishmael, the Braisa of Yosef HaKayin is Rabbi Akiva, and that is how we would go back and say that indeed it is a raya to Abaya. And once splitting up those Braisas, once showing how it could indeed be a raya to Rabbi Akiva, to Abaya, excuse me. Says the Gemara as we turn over to Kufam and Beis, excuse me. Rava Amar, a 5th and final Teretz. Says Rava, you know what's going on over here? Everything is after Chatzos. Like Kasha. Kan Kodesh Shachta V'Zarka Yalav. Kan Lach Shachta V'Zarka Yalav. Says Rava, you know what the chiluk is? The Einin does not bring the carbon pesach when the shchita, when the misa was before the shchita and before the zrika. When Rav Shimon said, yes, it's the carbon pesach, is where they ready to the shchita, they ready to the zrika, and only then did the relative die. Says the Gemara, what do you mean? The shchita was done. The zrika was done. So the carbon was finished. So what do you mean that right now Go and eat the carbon Pesach, you finish the carbon. Normally the achila is just what you do with the carbon. But says Ravina by the carbon Pesach, the achila is an intrinsic chelek, part and parcel of the mitzvah midirabba bar Ravuna, as Rabba bar Ravuna, as Rabba Ravuna has taught, as we're going to see. Amar lei. So Rava responded, Sayis my dekamar lecha. Rabba, listen to what your Rebbe is saying. Says the Gemara, so now let's understand this last din. My the Rabba Ravuna, what was this din? Titania, 6 lines down. Yom Shavua ki yom kvura lemitzvah sheva ushlayishim. The day of the Shemua. So when he hears about the Niftar, it's like the day of the burial. For the halachas of Shiva and Shleishim ulachilas psachim, ki yoim likot atzama. It's like the day that they gather the bones up to put it in a Yiddish kvura. Echad zeh v'echad zeh. In both of these cases, whether it's the day of the burial, whether it's the day of the kvura, whether it's the day of the gathering of the bones, v'eichel toivel, v'eichel kachim la'erev. You go to the mikvah and you let eat kachim that night. But Frank the Gemara, 1 second. Frank the Gemara, Hagufa Kasha, Amri Yom Shua Kiyan Fura, the Mitzvah Shliva Shleishim, Ulachilas Psachim, Kiyan Likarat Samois. And Achilas Psachim is the same as gathering the bones. That what? You're allowed to eat the Karban Pesach Mechlal. So what's the inference, we'll call it? What is the implication on the first line? The implication is that the Yom Kvura, he cannot eat the Karban Pesach even in the evening. But then the Brisa says, in both this case and that case, both the Yom HaKvura and the Yom of the gathering in the bones, the Aval goes to the mikvah and yes, eats the karbanos in the evening. So what do we see? We see that you yes eat the karban, and certainly the karban Pesach at the night after the kvura. So 2 terutim. Amar Rav Chista on the second white line, Tanoyi Tzmachlegis Tanoyim. And Rabbi Ravuna Amar Loi Kasha. Kasha Shamashmual Meisei Samach Lishkias Achama. Kasha Liglait Samach Lishkias Achama. Depends when it all happened. V'chein Shemeis Loi Meis V'kivru Samach Lishkias Achama. The Kan is going to be Lachar Shkias Achama. When do we say you don't bring the Korban Pesach the day after? It's only when you heard about it after Shkia, so the next day is the first day of Avelus. It's too late now. You already brought the Karban Pesach, and now there's a matzav of Misa. Who cares? So we see that by Karban Pesach, it breaks most rules. Usually you have the Akrovas HaKarban, the Zrikas Adam, and then the Achila is just what you do with the Karban. Says the Gemara, Nein, that when it comes to the Karban Pesach, the Achila is part and parcel, is intrinsic in the mitzvah itself. Rav Ashi Amar, 6 lines down, what does the Brisa mean when it says this in that case? Eats the Karban. Achi Kamar. Echad Yom Shmuah, Echad Yom Likot. Toivel Vaycha Bekachim L'Erev. Frakti Gemara, Vadu Rav Ashi, Badusi, Mechlal Allah. Says the Gemara, if you tell me it's a mistake, Mechdi. Alakai. Talking about the previous case, Zavizami Bayile Elishmamina, Badusi. Must be that the whole interpretation is one big mistake. Says the Gemara, let's go back to Rav Chista's Teretz. What was Rav Chista's Teretz? He said it's a machlokes Tanoim whether the Yom of Aninos extends to the next night or not. Uman Tanoi, says the Gemara. Who are these Tanoim? The Tani al Masai mitoinin alav kol hayoyim. Until when is an oinin? Also tikarbanis for the whole day. Also tikarbanis kol hayoyim the whole day. Rabbi Omer calls man as long as the body is not buried. Says the Gemara, of course the Yemisa grabs the dead night. So he said as long as it's not buried. So what's the deal? If it's indeed buried, then what? Istrale. Then there's no longer any of the dinim of aninos. But frak the Gemara the last day v'achrita kiyoymar, says the Gemara, but wait. The pasuk says, and it's going to be a day of mar, a day of bitterness. So it sounds like the kavura should dictate that the entirety of the day is aninos, and not just until the kavura. Says the, and afterwards not, says the Gemara, Rav Ashi Amar Rav Shisha Sanaya Teretz Ayayim Kavura Kai. The Bryce is referring out to Yom Kavura, and therefore, when's his last? Tanakama says last sentence of the day. Rebbe says it finishes the day prior. Masla Rav Yosef, wait. Sounds like Yom Kavura even be'erev not. So explains the Gemara, Amani. So who is this going like? Ela Teretz, but rather we're going to have to answer. Ad Masay Minan Love Kol Oisa Yom V'Leiloi. Rabbi Amar calls Manchlan Nikaver, the cover V'Leiloi, but then it will be different. Amro Rabbana Na Kamei the Rav Yirmi Amar Gaver Rav Krav Yosef Lema Achi Lema the Rabbi Lekula. And let's stop over here. I'll pick it up in this last statement as we continue to clarify the Brisa in Mirza Hashem.